Yeah. Hello, everyone. We are about to start. We will give people outside a couple more minutes to come to the venue. So please be patient, talk to your neighbor, talk to the person sitting close to you, get to know who they are, exchange contacts, do whatever you want to do. And we will start then in about 5 minutes. Please be patient. All right, so we're gonna start with the second part of the landscape talks. Today, we again have lots of interesting and exciting speakers who will come on stage to tell us about their research, about the work that they're doing, everything that has to do with landscapes and also with the environment. Now, I had said it earlier, I'm gonna say it again. Every speaker has 7 minutes. You have a timer here. So you cannot say that you were not warned, that you didn't know the time was running. Please try to stick to the time. 7 minutes is all that we can give you. But of course, anybody who wants to talk to the speakers after the talk or after the session can do so during the break. And then I also have a very big request to you, my audience. Please make sure that you support everybody who will come on stage. I want you to give a big round of applause to everybody who's coming on stage, and right after they're done, again, we will clap for the people. So, speakers, 7 minutes. In those 7 minutes, you can do whatever you want to do. Please use the whole stage. Don't just stand there in the corner, or don't just stand in that corner. You can dance, you can jump, you can show us your favorite yoga pose, whatever, as long as you keep us entertained and also informed. And now, I would like to welcome my first speaker for this session. It is Aldert van Weeren. He is a cattail farmer, and I have to say that I didn't know what cattail was. I had to look that up, but I'm sure that he will tell us more about what he does. Welcome.
Thank you. 4 years in 7 minutes. That's not easy for me, and this is not my normal job. This is about cattail farming, but cattail farming is about water. When you take away the water from a peatland, it looks very romantic, but the peatland, the soil, starts emitting carbon dioxide in a fast way. And the soil is degrading with about 1 centimeter a year. So this very romantic picture is even promoted by the UNESCO World Heritage. They love drainage of peatland. It's very romantic, but this country, which you see, is drowning 1 centimeter a year, every year again. Outside, in the rest of the world, this is happening also. In warmer countries, it's even going faster. And sometimes it's an annoyance, like in California, where they should keep the water, we now know. But in Holland, they know exactly what's happening to them. This is the newest climate atlas from 2 weeks ago. And all those areas you see, this is how far they are going down for the next 20 or 50 years. So they are sitting behind the dike. They were once 2 meters above sea level, and they are now partly 6 meters below sea level, and it's going on with a rising sea level. This is not climate smart. This is not sustainable. And of course they say, yeah, look at Indonesia. Look at Russia. All over the world there are peatlands, but this hotspot you see here is very clear. And that we should stop emitting carbon dioxide is also very clear. This is in May last year. Warmer water in the North Sea, warmer water in the Baltic make for a new generation of supercell thunderstorms. And this is an F4 tornado, which is not in Texas, but is in Germany. Flooding, flash flooding. This is also on UNESCO. This is an ice front of an old city with torrential rain. We had 300 floodings in the Elbe, on the border with Poland, in the last 20 years. We had the warmest October, we had the driest April, since we are measuring, which is very strange. And the Dutch, we can cope with it. Look at this river. It's filled to the top. There is no room. Look at this very tiny dike. Rivers are topped. There's no place for water anymore. There are programs, room for the river. But where is this room for the river? And people living here, who have been evacuated, are asked, what's worse? Traffic is more dangerous as this. They still believe they can survive this kind of future. This is not because of torrential rain. This is because of heat stress. In 2003, there was a heat wave in Holland, and a dike just broke completely. The canal, which you see on the front, so boats lying there, just flooded the city, and the part which is not flooded, the gas piping in the streets broke. It's something we need to do. And they find funny things like submerged drainage, which all not working. And we have a very puzzled system of water management, which is absolutely not climate smart and sustainable. You can't go on. It looks like this. There is no possibility to use these lands anymore in 100 years or in 200 years. And there is a solution. What you see here is cattail growing on peatlands, which are with water on them. Soil subsidence stops immediately, and emitting CO2 stops immediately. You can build from Tifa houses. This is a German house on the exhibition in Mailand, made from Tifa board. And Tifa can be grown in a constructed wetland. And constructed wetlands we all know, because once we cleaned our water with constructed wetlands. And one of the things cattail is doing is cleaning water. They need a lot of nitrogen, and they take the nitrogen from the water, and they produce clean water. All these things, just read them, I'm not mentioning them. There is much more biodiversity in a constructed wetland with Tifa. A landscape structure is much better. It's holding back water for drier times. It's cleaning water. It can be used as water retention places. The only benefit I have, I insulated my house with it. What you see here is cattail cavity insulation, but there was no possibility to buy it on the market. So I had to grow it myself. It's not easy, it's not always working, but the strange thing is, why is nobody else doing it? This is European. This is not an agricultural crop. This is a wheat. And wheats are not subventioned. I get 400 euros where I put a cow on the land and drain the peatland. So hundreds of millions every year are spent on agricultural money for draining peatlands. So we have subventions on draining peatlands. So the Europeans should not point to Asia. They should take themselves by their own nose and try to do something about this. And then this is about landscapes. Many people say, I'm destroying the landscape. This landscape you see here started 2 meters above sea level 1,000 years ago, and it's now the lowest point in this part of Holland. Am I changing the landscape? I don't think so. The cultural structure which is grown will still be there. So there is no problem. We can do this. We can do this fast. It's very low tech. It doesn't cost much money, and it brings us a product which we can build carbon free. So this is bio-based economy. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aldert. So I also want to say hi to everybody who's watching us on the live stream. Hey, hope you can see us. And I hope that you're having a good time just as we are here in this venue. Our next speaker is Adrian Martin. He is a professor of environment and development at the School of Economic Development at the University of East Anglia in the UK. And he will tell us about performance of land use intensification for poverty eradication in forest frontier locations. Adrian, welcome.
Great, thank you very much.
And may I just interrupt? When I say Adrian, welcome, thank you.
Thank you again. So what I really want to do in the next 7 or 8 minutes is to challenge the idea that land use intensification, and particularly forms of agricultural intensification, provide some simple blueprint for future sustainability and food security. I want to start with what we think we do know. So we know that land is a scarce commodity. We know it's becoming scarcer. We know that human numbers are growing, and our appetites are growing even faster. Some project that demand for food crops could even double by the year 2050. At the same time as demand is growing, we know that some land is declining in its ability to produce food crops. There's soil degradation, climate change, problems with supplying water. And there's also greater competition for land. We know that we need more land for urban expansion. We need it for increasing our network of protected areas, for reforestation, perhaps for growing bioenergy crops. And this is a powerful nexus of problems. How are we as a society going to achieve security of food, energy, water in the face of changing climate in the future? So what is the solution, or rather what are the solutions to this nexus of problems? Well, we can think of four basic types. Firstly, we could reduce our demand for food by eating less, and by eating less meat in particular. Secondly, we could try to reduce waste. We know about a third of food crops are lost post-harvest currently. And thirdly, we could redistribute, or distribute better, such that the needs and wants of the global elite are not gained at the expense of the global poor. And fourthly, we can do as we've done rather successfully in the past, we can grow more. We can grow more by expanding the area of land we grow food on, or perhaps better still, we can seek to grow more on the same area of land by increasing yields. We can do what we might call sustainable intensification, in which we increase yields whilst not increasing environmental impacts. And this, in a sense, is what the SDGs are calling for. SDG 2 calls for smallholders worldwide to double productivity by 2030, whilst SDG 15 calls on land use to be sustainable. Sustainable intensification. And this sounds great. This sounds like what we want, right? But now, the problem is, we've moved away from what we know. Now we're in the territory of what we don't know. Because we don't really know how to define or measure intensification, and we're certainly not realizing it in practice. So this is what we have set out to understand better. What is the performance of land use intensification? And it turns out that there are relatively few academic studies that study the impact of intensification both on human well-being and on environment. We found 61 cases, we've scrutinized those, and we've tried to identify whether they are indeed examples of sustainable intensification. So what have we found? Well, the headline finding is that we find relatively few cases that meet the criteria of a win for environment and a win for human well-being, 10 out of the 61. Bottom right-hand corner of that figure shows the most common case, which is where gains in human well-being from intensification are accompanied by losses in terms of ecosystems. But almost as common, bottom left-hand corner, are lose-lose cases in which attempts to intensify agricultural production in particular lead to negative outcomes not only for the environment but also for human well-being. We might say, well, at least we've identified 10 cases of win-win outcomes. And I'd love to be able to stand here and say, yes, I'm really confident that those 10 provide a model for the future that we can replicate, learn from, and scale up. But if I'm honest, I have to say that I'm not even confident that those 10 are necessarily clear examples of sustainable intensification, mainly because they tend to measure types of outcome which are more often positive, including food production, and they don't tend to measure outcomes which are less often positive, including impacts on biodiversity, on soils, and on water regulation. Okay, so what's going wrong here? Well, if we looked across our 61 cases, we'd find actually that it's a complex picture. There are many different trade-offs going on, and there are many different pathways towards those trade-offs. But I want to mention just two of these, which are perhaps most common. First off, we're seeing many cases of ecological trade-offs, in which provisioning and regulating ecosystem services are traded off against each other. In practice, this normally means that increases in food production are gained at the expense of decreases in some key regulating services, including services to water, pests, diseases, and soil quality. Secondly, we see social trade-offs in which wealthier groups invest and prosper from intensification, whilst the poor tend to lack the assets to actually participate and therefore get left behind, exactly what the SDGs ask us not to do. And they not only get left behind, because they also suffer from the environmental impacts caused by their wealthier neighbours who are investing in intensification. So it's a kind of double whammy for them. So what do we do? Well, first off, as I started out, we must not assume that intensification of agricultural production is an easy blueprint to our problems. And we shouldn't assume that it relieves us of the need to pursue some of the other options, including changing our consumption habits and redistributing. We must not leave behind the poor, and at a minimum, we should be considering some kind of safety nets to ensure that they don't lose out from these interventions. And finally, we should be measuring the things that we really need to measure, not just food production and income, but also some of the wider and longer-term environmental impacts from these interventions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. To anybody who wants to post things on social media, everything that has to do with the landscape talks, be it photos that you're taking here of the people who are on stage, be it quotes from our speakers, be it short videos, please make sure that you use the following hashtags. We have hashtag ThinkLandscape, and we have hashtag GLFBonn 2017. And our next speaker is Dr. Shafi Nur Islam. He's an assistant professor at University Brunei Darussalam, and he'll be here to tell us more about mangroves and wetlands ecosystem management in Bangladesh. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You are welcome to mangrove presentation. I would like you to an unknown story on Bangladesh. It is a great chance to know this unknown story about the Sundarbans mangrove forest. It is the largest forest, mangrove forest or mangrove wetlands in the world. On the other hand, it's located in the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna delta. It is a mega delta, the largest mega delta in the world. Maybe some of you don't know. Two largest locations, two largest thing in Bangladesh. So this is a nice pictures. One is the Eritrea forest. The name, Bengali name is the Sundari. This name is also bearing the name of the forest, the Sundarban, the beautiful forest. And these outgrowing roads, this is the characters of the mangrove forest. And this is a nice and beautiful forest. Now it's under threat because of human influence or anthropogenic disturbance, climate change, and natural calamities. This mangrove in the world, it is only 25 to 35 in north and 35 south location in the middle of the world. We can say two zones. It is Atlantic East Pacific and the Indo-West Pacific regions are the diversity of the mangrove forest or mangrove wetland areas. And this is specifically Asia-Pacific region is these hotspots of mangrove biodiversity. And Bangladesh and Sundarbans is located within these Indo-West Pacific regions. In this, Bangladesh is located in the catchment area of these three largest rivers, the Ganges catchment area, and the Brahmaputra catchment area, and the Meghna catchment area. These three rivers entered in Bangladesh. And the south of the Ganges, south of this Bangladesh, is located in the mouth of the Ganges River or estuaries. This is a green part of this, is showing this is the mangrove. And mangrove, it is, Sundarban mangrove is already within Bangladesh and India. In between there is a border area. And the Ganges River is playing a potential role to protect the balance of the ecosystem and ecosystem services. And this is why water and the Ganges River is very much potential for the management of the mangrove wetlands and ecosystems. And these areas, Bangladesh is the 1/3 of the land. It is a Ganges River area, Ganges Deltaic area. This deltaic area is a very fertile landscape for food productions. And these 33% of these food productions are coming from these deltaic regions. Now this deltaic landscape is threatened because of the high salinity intrusions due to shortage of the fresh water from the Ganges basin, as well as the sea level rise, the sea water, saline water increasing in the upstream area. So that's it is a threat for the food security and the community livelihood in the coastal regions. This again, I talk about this wonderful landscape, the mangrove landscape, the water, the plants, animals, and the rivers is a wonderful combination in the Sundarban inside. Some of you may perhaps already visited inside the Sundarbans. Wonderful land, but is under threat now. There's a lot of people, as indigenous group already inside the Sundarbans. They are already living, collecting their resources, and surviving on their livelihoods based on the Sundarban mangrove resources, as well as ecosystem services. On the upper stairs, you can see a lot of visitors. 50,000 tourists every day entering in this Sundarbans area. And this is visitors or the tourists. On the other hand, the government and others, local authorities, they are trying to develop ecosystem, ecotourism development. But the trends of the tourists, it is developing the mass tourism. It's not even ecotourism. It is also the disturbance for this landscape. And another disturbance or the threat for the Sundarban, as well as threats for the Ganges River and Ganges Delta. In the morning, some expert, already by high-level experts, are talking about this, the pollution of the Ganges water. It is a holy river for Hindu, Christian, Muslim, all religious people, but it is not at the moment, at this stage, it's the polluted river. And you can see this border area in the map. The upstream, this is a barrage. This is a so-called very internationally famous. They say it is a Farakka barrage. On the downstream in the Bangladesh part, this is a Gorai River bridge. It's the same river basin, the upstream area and the downstream area. At the same time, I was visited. Then upstream, it is a huge water, and the downstream, you can see, is totally dry. So the basin landscape is already changing due to the shortage of the fresh water. And this river connected to the Sundarbans, which is carrying the fresh water and saving or balance these mangrove ecosystems. But now it is a threat because of this shortage of the fresh water. So seawater is increasing and salinity is increasing. This is a history of this river water in the black line. This before 75, it was a huge water in the basin. After the construction of the barrage, we draw this water from the basin. So suddenly this salinity, the red line increasing, which is threat for some sensitive mangrove plants and some animals. For example, Erythrea fomes. These plants cannot survive. What's happened, this mangrove species we will see next. This is a whole Sundarban in the Bangladesh part. Different color is representing different species, but very much green is this dominating species, like Erythrea fomes. Now it is changing because of this salinity, one of the threat, and high salinity, and also human influence or some other things. This affected area, red color, it is the one kind of disease, affected top-dying disease for the Erythrea fomes. That's this, the secondary forest is developing even in these mangrove wetlands. So we can see some of the vegetation height class and the changing pattern, 2 years 1933 and 1985. The green color, it is the best quality of the forest plant species, is reducing now. So it is also gradually changing. Near future, it will be more threatened situation for the Sundarbans areas. Now, for the human influence directly affected the Sundarbans, forest lands is reducing, changing. It is a professional or business purposes are using the landscape are changing, and the down to pictures, it's a special type of landscape changing for and using for the stream cultivation. All over the world now, the mangrove is a threat for stream cultivation, and Sundarban, it is not different from others. So it is also now threat for this natural landscape for the mangrove. So based on this situation, what would be the solutions? We have this water sharing agreement between Bangladesh and India. In reality, it is not working. So Sundarbans is under threat due to shortage of the fresh water. In such a way, we propose we need some fresh water supply to this forest area or this in the mangrove wetlands areas. This is a whole best catchment area, Ganges, Brahmaputra, and the Meghna. The very much a blue color, this is from the Nepal, there is a huge water. So we can make a channel. So in the dry season, through this channel, this water can enter in the Sundarban areas. And also the green channel, this is the Ganges basin area. This will also we need this bilateral agreement or regional cooperation. Because Sundarbans, the mangrove is offering the ecosystem services for the whole region. Whole people, they are the stakeholders in the whole region. We need a regional cooperation, integrated management plan to protect these Sundarbans or the mangrove wetland ecosystem and this landscape. That's all for today. Thank you very much for your participation and reception.
Thank you very much, Dr. Islam. And from Bangladesh, we come back to Germany. My next speaker works here in Bonn, Hannes Dempewolf. He's the head of global initiatives at the Crop Trust, and he will tell us about crop diversity for a hot and crowded planet. You're welcome.
Thank you. So you may ask yourself, we're here at a landscape conference. Why on earth is this guy up there talking about seeds? And I'll try to convince you over the next 7 minutes that, in fact, seeds have a lot to do with landscapes. Seeds are the foundation of agriculture, the biological foundation of agriculture. The genetic diversity that is contained within these seeds is underpinning global food supplies everywhere. And if you think about landscapes, really what you should see here is foodscapes. You should think about how these landscapes have, in concert with human diversity, evolved and helped biological diversity, agricultural biological diversity, seed diversity to evolve. So if you talk about crop diversity, you talk about human diversity and landscape diversity, and together, in a mix of evolution over many, many thousands of years, we have gained crop diversity. Crop diversity, when we talk about that, we have to think about, of course, where it comes from. And you can see here that our crops that we eat all around the world originate from many, many different parts. Mainly in sort of so-called centers of domestication. We have a lot of crops originating from these parts of the world. Most of them are not in Europe or in North America. They're often in tropical zones. Of course, in West Asia, we have the most important origin of crop diversity, the Fertile Crescent, where agriculture in this area originated and spread into many parts of the world. And so when we talk about crop diversity, we should also always think about where does this crop diversity originate from and where is it still found in farmers' fields. We've looked at this a couple of years ago we looked at data that has been accumulated over several decades at FAO that mapped out the use of different crops in different countries for the production of agricultural commodities, and also the food consumptions, the calorie values that coming out of these foods. And if you look at where what we eat in the different parts of the world, as mapped out here in this diagram, you can see where the food calories that we're using are actually coming from, where the crops originate from. And if you do this progressively, you can see how the world, every part of the world, is connected to another part of the world. And we call this the global web of interdependence in primary regions of diversity of crops and food supplies. So crop diversity is a truly global common good. No country is self-sufficient in the diversity that it holds, and we are all, as humanity, dependent on each other to provide access to that diversity. We then also looked at a time series and tried to figure out, is our dependence or our interdependence on this diversity globally growing over time? And yes, it does look like indeed crop diversity, the interdependence of nations on crop diversity is growing. So we are becoming more and more interdependent, and a lot of that has to do with a global homogenization of food supplies. We eat in more and more parts of the world, we eat more and more of the same things. That is due to forces of globalization, but also climate change means that more and more farmers in different parts of the world have to look at using different types of crops, again, often crops from elsewhere, which means that we, again, increase our interdependence. Climate change, I already mentioned it, the impacts of climate change on agriculture are predicted to be severe. With every degree rise in temperature, we're thinking about a 2% decrease in agricultural yield. And these effects vary vastly across the globe. Different parts of the world are affected by climate change very, very differently. Here are just a few examples. But every agricultural system that is facing climate change and that is trying to come up with a solution will have to have very localized solutions that work for a particular system and the particular challenges it's facing. And this is where, again, crop diversity is really important because many of these varieties that we have in our crops are adapted locally to specific environments and specific landscapes that they've been originating from. One example of the importance and the complexity of modern breeding is shown in this slide, where we've looked at some data of a popular wheat variety, which is the product of 3,170 different crosses involving 51 plant genetic resources from 26 countries. Again, you can see how incredibly interdependent we are also when it comes to modern crop breeding and crop improvement. So when we talk about the use of this diversity for climate change adaptation, we can think about the use of it in breeding to develop climate-ready varieties, but also the direct use of greater diversity by farmers can lead to more resilience in production systems. It also can play a role in mitigation. Use of diversity in crop breeding for varieties that require less inputs is an obvious one. And you can even think about ways to design production systems that act as carbon sinks. Perennial crops is a great example there, where you actually create carbon sinks in agriculture. At the same time, unfortunately, we're losing a lot of the diversity. Here in Germany, a good example is apples. There were literally thousands of different apple varieties. Even here in the Rhineland, were grown only 200, 300, 400 years ago. But now, all the major apple varieties grown in Germany originate from only 6 varieties. This is only one example to show you how crop diversity is disappearing from landscapes everywhere. If you think about the rich landscape that I showed you as an introduction, unfortunately, more and more what we're seeing are landscapes like this. Landscapes that are much more homogenized, landscapes that are much less diverse, and landscapes that also harbor much less crop diversity. Here are another few numbers to just show you the scale of the issue. In China, we think we've lost about 90% of rice varieties since the 50s. in Mexico, about 80% of the corn varieties since the early 1900s. So what to do to counter this? I'm just going to take you on a brief journey up to the far, far north. This is the very northern tip of Norway, Svalbard. There's a lot of things there, including polar bears and a lot of reindeer, but there's also this seed vault that is built into the side of a mountain. It acts as the backup vault, the backup facility for seed banks everywhere around the world, where this crop diversity can be rescued and saved to be recovered from in case disaster strikes. This backup facility is connected to many active gene banks, international collections, and also national collections. We here at the Crop Trust in Bonn work with many of these gene banks. The international collections, first and foremost, it's one of the biggest international systems that is conserving that crop diversity and making it available every year. Luckily, the importance of crop diversity is now recognized specifically in the SDGs. SDG Target 2.5 speaks about the importance of crop diversity and also ways we can safeguard this. And we have here at the Crop Trust recently launched an initiative in support of this SDG Target 2.5 called Food Fiber. So I ask everyone here in this room to think about the importance of crop diversity, actions you can take to make sure that the diversity in your diets is a substantial one. We need to come together to safeguard, share, use, and celebrate crop diversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannes. I have to say that I'm very, very proud of my speakers. You guys have not only kept time, I think some of you have spent less time than you were allocated, so that means we are ahead of time right now, and we only have one speaker left. And I had been asked earlier whether we are gonna receive questions from the audience. I said we're not going to do that because of time, but we have time now, so maybe we will do a question and answer session after the last speaker. My sound engineer, if I can see you somewhere, can we get mics later? I'm looking, Fabio? Yeah, okay, so after this speaker, we will get some mics to the audience and then people can ask questions. But now, a warm welcome to Eva Hermanovic. She is a communications specialist with the European Forest Genetic Resource Program, and she will tell us about plans and efforts to afforest Iceland. You're welcome, Eva.
Thank you. Imagine the Vikings arriving to settle Iceland in the 9th century. They could look like this. The saga of Iceland, the accounts of first settlers, begins with a description of Iceland. Iceland was wooded from the beach to the mountains. In fact, it is estimated that the forest probably covered 25 to 40% of the country. However, the Vikings were Iron Age people, and they did what Iron Age culture did. They slashed and burned the forests to grow hay and barley and to create grazing land. They used the timber for building and for charcoal for their forges. By most accounts, the island was largely deforested within 3 centuries. The lack of vegetation that keeps the loose volcanic soil together, combined with strong winds, quickly led to soil erosion. As a result, Iceland is a case study in deforestation. About 40% of the country is a desert. It's an ecological disaster. In Icelandic language, the word for desert is eidmörk, which literally means wasted forest. In the 1950s, forest cover was well below 1%. After decades of efforts, this number has now risen up to 2% last year. And in theory, 30 to 40% of the country could support woodlands. But the official goal of the Iceland National Forest Strategy is much more modest. It's 12% forest cover by 2100. However, restoration is not only about planting trees. Its success requires careful planning and a choice of genetically adapted material to be self-sustaining over time with changing environmental conditions. This may take many years, from finding the right seed sources to testing them, growing them in right quantities in nurseries, planting and monitoring those forests. In cold Icelandic conditions, this may take up to 20 years. So no donor is willing to fund a restoration project lasting 20 years. To address this timeframe issue, Iceland has built these efforts into its long-term national strategy. This allows to find sufficient time to use material that is genetically adapted for current and future climatic conditions. Therefore, what we can learn from Icelanders is not only to persist in harsh climate, but also to find mechanisms that support long-term funding and planning of restoration efforts. And the film I made for European Forest Genetic Resources Program that I'm going to show you shortly encapsulates the story of Iceland. And what I would like to see more is lessons from around the world in a format of a story, just as the one that we were trying to tell with Iceland, so that we can all learn from each other and that stories that we can all relate to. And I welcome your thoughts and questions after the screening.
What I love about working in forestry is the chance every once in a while to get out of the office and walk in the woods. To see the forests growing, to see that we're actually doing some good is a very rewarding thing, a very satisfying thing. But Iceland is certainly among the worst examples in the world of deforestation. It doesn't take very many people or very many sheep to deforest a whole country over 1,000 years. Iceland used to be much more wooded. The people coming brought sheep and cattle and swine. Land needed to be cleared, and their grazing prevented the forest from coming back. And after a long time, the thin vegetation cover that's left is susceptible to disturbances like frost heaving and storms in the wintertime. Basically rips open. The soil is exposed in part. It starts washing away or blowing away. That's what we see in very, very large parts of Iceland. My mission is to support growing more forests and better forests, to make land more productive and more able to tolerate the pressures that we put on it. There are other needs of forests. Biomass, lumber, lots of different things. We started using exotic species because the native birch simply isn't productive. Knowing which trees to plant is actually harder than you'd think. We plant about 3 million seedlings per year in Iceland. Most people have simply, until now, you use what you have. Here in Iceland, it's the native birch. Plant them, and you expect that they grow. And then the climate changes. The winters have become milder. Many of the trees that we planted in the 1950s, especially Siberian larch, are literally dying after several decades of being reasonably good. Sitting there dead in the landscape, and it's difficult to find the money to do something else with the land, becomes a problem. Our aim is to produce the seed that we need here in Iceland, that it will eventually all be of genetically well-adapted material. The genetics of forest trees are important. How much heat they need in the summer to grow, how tolerant they are to drought, when they know to stop growing in the autumn. These are all things that are genetically determined in the trees. And through the years, we've found the species that we can use, and now we're selecting individuals that are best adapted bringing them together in a seed orchard and using their offspring in afforestation. The seedlings are produced in modern tree nurseries with greenhouses. They're all containerized seedlings, which are very easy to plant. And we produce all of them here in Iceland. Right now, I am optimistic for forestry in Iceland. The trees are growing. People call us at the Forest Service and say, I've got a shelter wall that I want to build. I need some cladding for my summer cabin, or I want to build a pagan church. Can you help us? And we say, well, yes, we can. We're producing wood now. We're producing boards and planks. We have the trees in the woods, and we can cut them down. The forests are growing better than anybody ever thought. People will more and more look at them and say, hey, this is something that's worth having. This is not something that was obvious to Icelanders only a few decades ago. That's a great cause for optimism.
Thank you.
A great cause for optimism. Thank you very much, Eva. And as promised, you now get a chance to ask our speakers questions if you want to know more about the work they're doing, about what they have presented. So I will just ask all of you to please come in front. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. Somebody will come with a mic and give you the chance to tell us what you want to know. I have a mic there. Yeah. Okay. We can move a little so that the people that are watching the live stream can see us. Okay, yeah, I think this is perfect. All right, do we have any questions? Anything you want to know about Iceland, about crop diversity, about cattail? Okay, we have the lady in front here. And you can say whether you want to direct that question at one person or if it's just for everybody.
Hi, I have a question about crop diversity. Could you maybe explain how or what exactly you gather about the different seeds? I know that for the apple seeds in Germany, for example, there are local efforts to gather data when different apple species were used, in which regions exactly they were used, or yeah, how much data do you gather?
Yeah,
Thank you.
So should I use this? Okay. That's a really important point. In fact, the seed banks are only so useful as the data that we have about their holdings, because if you want to utilize the material, you really need to know what you're looking for. And so there's a lot of efforts around gathering data about the seeds and the germplasm in those banks. A lot of that really depends on the crop that you're looking at. Some of that data is gathered at the moment that material is collected. So for new collections from farmers' fields or from the wild, the location of where that material comes from, how it's been used, its phenotype at the time of collecting would be gathered and put in a database. But then there's also occasionally material is grown out and characterized. Many of these seeds don't stay alive forever, so you have to multiply them, you have to regenerate them after 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And often that is used as an occasion to, again, gather more data about their performance. But often you really only can figure out the value of that diversity or of a particular accession when you grow it in an environment that is realistic and so growth trials, basically, or trials along environmental gradients are really, really important to better understand what the value of that diversity is.
Thank you.
All right. So I've been told that this mic will be special for you, and the rest of you will, the other mics will work, will be switched on. All right, do we have any other questions, comments, remarks?
Yes, hello, I'm Franziska from the University of Hohenheim, and I have a question to you, Eva, because I have been traveling actually a lot in Iceland, and I know what people link to the landscape there is actually that it is without trees, because people don't know it otherwise. So what people combine with landscape in Iceland is that you have the wide view there, and that there are actually no trees when you drive on the street, so you just see hundreds of meters on both sides. And I talked to some Icelanders about this topic, and actually even Icelanders themselves are not all of them a lot for the forest, because they also connect the landscape to this wide view they have, and they enjoy it a lot. So how do you consider this problem, or those different views?
Yes, thank you. That's a very valid point, and it's a constant debate in Iceland about what to keep, whether we want to keep the forest, the landscape as we see it, as we know it, because we think this is actually the Icelandic forest, or invest in restoration of the forest. And the thing is that the forests only cover 2% of the area, so even if they expand to 12%, there will always be very little forests with 12%. So there will still be those big valleys with the streams that you can admire, with great areas of landscape without any vegetation. But then we also have to remember that no vegetation leads to soil erosion, and eventually there is nothing that can grow, and that cannot even support sheep grazing or things that farmers would think would be the original purpose of that landscape. So I would say they don't exclude one another, and they would have to find a compromise to grow forests, to be able to produce their own timber and restore the landscape from erosion, and at the same time keep some parts of Iceland that are beautiful as they are, as people like them.
Thank you.
Another question there.
Hi, I had a question also about the crop diversity. You commented how much we are interdependent, and I think it's kind of related. How much of these crops, the diversity, we are losing because we are growing just a lot of crops that are commercially more viable, so that we can send them abroad here and there and make more money?
So yeah. I think it's an important point. The sort of industrialization of agricultural production in many parts of the world has certainly contributed to, and continues to contribute to, a decrease of diversity in farmers' fields, something we call genetic erosion, the loss of that diversity. But at the same time, sort of the irony of the whole thing is that breeders and also large breeding companies that need to develop new crops actually need access to that diversity for their own breeding efforts. So whenever we speak to, for example, big ag companies, they understand why we're doing and that this is important. So you're right. It's interconnected to the need to conserve in order to be able to have the resource available for use. And we're not being ignorant about this, that everyone should grow, and subsistence type agriculture, that's not a solution either. But it certainly is true that there's a lot more diversity in those systems present still.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Yeah. There's a question here in the front row.
Hello, my name is Florentin Jäger. I'm a student from the University of Freiburg, and I have a question to Mr. van Weeren. You very briefly talked about subsidies from the European Union to cow farming. Could you explain how do you think could this be changed in advance to cattail farming, to keeping CO2 in the soil?
Good question. farmers who in the future will grow cattail on formerly drained peatland are carbon farming. And in a way, they should be able to earn money with this carbon farming. When we tell ourselves that in 2020 or 2030, 1 ton of carbon dioxide will be having the worth of 30 euros. So I get, when I've re-wet my 1 hectare, I get 15 tons every year, which I should be able to handle with. I can sell it to somebody who wants to make a parking lot, or somebody buys it from me because he has a gas plant. In the situation in the European Union now, the subsidies on agriculture are destroying the soil. So the subsidy is not binded to the way how I do agriculture. If I put a cow on drained peatland, I still get 400 euros a hectare because I use this land. And it's not seen that I'm destroying this land, because this land is subsiding 1 centimeter every year and it's vanishing in the air. And it's emissions which come from there. With cows on it, there's also methane from the cows, so it's double. And there is no subsidy on cattail, because cattail is not on the list of agricultural crops. This is also the case with reed. And now we import reed from Chinese nature reserve areas, instead of just putting reed and TIFA on the list of agricultural crops. And then suddenly, I'm also able to get subventions because it's between potatoes and carrots. And then everything turns around, because then farmers say, oh, there's a future in here. The future will be that my carbon farming and the fact that all those ecosystem services with constructed wetlands can be calculated. We now know exactly how many tons of dry mass capture how many nitrogen, how many carbon dioxide. So we can calculate these things, and we can pick money to these things. So the future will be bright, but we have to change the rules and regulations in Europe very fast and very clearly.
Thank you very much. Anybody who wants to know more about intensive farming, intensive land use, about mangroves in Bangladesh, this is your chance. Please, if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you. Last chance. Questions? All right. If there are none, then another big round of applause for our speakers, please. And thank you very much for asking questions and participating. So this is the end of the second part of today's landscape talks. We will have a break now, and the talks will continue at 4. At this venue. So you can take a break and then come back, and also please bring your friends, colleagues, people that you find on the way. They're very welcome to join us here at the Landscape Talks. Thank you very much.